Hello and welcome. My name is Rick. This is the Bactrian. This starts my next series on motorcycling and first aid. And this series will be all about the acronym S.A.F.E, S-A-F-E. And S.A.F.E stands for survey. The A stands for assessment. And it will include the ABCs, airway, breathing, and circulation. The F stands for first aid, administer first aid as needed. And finally, the E stands for evaluation. As always, this information is in no way meant to be a substitute for professional medical evaluation and treatment. I would strongly suggest taking an EMT course and becoming trained in CPR to deliver the best care in the field. May God speak to you through these videos and grant you safety and enjoyment through all your adventures. And we're back in the garage. Let's continue with the S.A.F.E acronym. Concerning the S, survey, there are multiple important points. The first thing I want to get into is how our brain works and doesn't work during times of stress. My wife and I were just talking about this. She's a nurse as well. The more stressed we are, the narrower our focus is, and the fewer options we see, and it's very difficult to make rational decisions under significant stress. If you see someone hurt, or you're in an accident yourself or involved in the accident, not really the best time to be critically thinking. Some level of practice, a script, something that you can plug in and do, training like for anything, will serve you better than trying to think critically in a stressful situation. The S in survey serves multiple functions. And one of them is to stop and take a minute and gather your thoughts before rushing in to danger yourself. So that brings me to the first part of survey, is surveying the scene. Something caused that accident in the first place. Maybe you witnessed it, maybe you know what caused the accident, and you can determine whether that threat, that danger is still there. Or maybe you came upon a scene and there's an accident there, and you need to be able to see if that danger that caused the original accident still persists and might put you in danger if you rush into a scene to try and help someone. Rock slides, down trees, deep rushing water. These are all things that can cause accidents, oncoming traffic, but that also can be a danger for rescuers. So it's very important to stop, collect yourself, think about what's going on, try to engage that prefrontal cortex and get out of that midbrain, and have some more rational thought, and be able to approach the scene and be safe yourself. If you rush into the scene and become injured yourself, that makes it difficult for first responders. Now we have multiple victims instead of one, instead of the original victim. Okay, so after we survey the scene, we're going to survey, I'm going to call them the victim, could also be the client. You'll hear me use the client quite frequently. So the victim or the client, whomever was involved in the accident, and it might be you might be the client or the victim. We'll talk about that as well. Years ago, I was involved in an avalanche and I needed rescuing, and I was surveying the scene around me. Did the avalanche stop? Was there any more snow moving? And I started surveying myself. Did I have circulation? How much could I move? Et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, I was rescued and everything was fine. We survey the scene, then we survey the victim or the client, okay? Do they have deformed limbs? Is there scuff marks on them that would indicate where they landed and slid? Is that going to be on the chest or the helmet, on the back? On arms and elbows and knees. These are all pretty common landing spots. When I broke this clavicle, I landed right here. I was ejected off a bicycle and landed right here and broke this clavicle. I've fallen like this and broke this wrist, fallen on my head and destroyed, I was on a bicycle and destroyed my bicycle helmet. So when you look at that victim, do they have deformed limbs? Is there something obvious? Is there obvious bleeding? Or are there scuff marks that would indicate a landing and sliding if there was movement, which there often is in a motorcycle, and that kinetic energy causing injury. So if you see things that would indicate neck injury, scuffing the helmet, and even if you don't see any scuffs on the helmet, we want to be very careful with the cervical spine. Years ago, I actually took care of a client in the hospital who was involved in a motorcycle accident when he was a young man. So he lost almost all of the movement from the level of the injury down. We don't want to really move that person. We want to determine whether or not they're breathing. Part of our survey of them is the deformities, the scrapes, and so on. And then we want to determine whether they're conscious, breathing, have a heart rate, etc. We'll get more into that in a second. That's the A, the assessment phase. But we can get up close to them if the scene is safe and look, listen, feel. We can look to see if their chest is rising and falling. We can listen for breathing. And if we can get our ear close to their mouth, sometimes might be hard with a full face helmet. Sometimes we can hear or feel breath on our ear. So we're looking at the chest, if it's rising and falling and breathing. We can listen for air escaping the mouth, okay, inhaling and exhaling, obviously. And we can feel that possibly on our ear even with the full face helmet. That's our survey, that's the S. The scene, is it safe? Get down to the victim. What are our probable injuries? There might be dozens that we can't see and wouldn't be able to without X-ray or CT scan, whatever. And then we're going to assess whether our client, our victim, is breathing. And then we're going to get into the A for the assessment. Okay, so we're going to start with the ABCs: airway, breathing, circulation. And when we went up in the latter part of our survey and we tried to determine if they were breathing, it's possible to hear breathing through this, definitely to see the chest rise and fall, even with the jacket on and things. If you watch, if you're careful, you want to be careful to not move the victim at this point, okay? We don't know anything that's going on yet. We're very concerned about injury, so we want to not move the victim. We want to continue on to the A and the ABCs. Now, with a full face helmet like mine, to lift the visor, it requires some force and put some torque on the cervical spine, okay? And this is really heavy. I'm gonna talk more about this in a little bit. But to open this visor, to look at the airway, which is the nose and the mouth, and then the trachea and the bronchus, and then the lungs. To open this, to assess the first part of the airway, the nose and the mouth, requires some torquing, okay? And if somebody has a cervical spine injury, we're promoting secondary injury. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. So we want to be careful with the neck at all costs. Be very careful with the neck. And we're going to get more into that in a little bit. But to assess the airway with a modular helmet, a little bit easier if you could flip up the whole face of it and then the entire airway is exposed. The nose and the mouth, you can see clearly, okay? Again, be super careful moving anybody. I would not recommend moving anybody unless they're gonna drown, they're laying in the middle of the road and semis are coming. Unless you or them are in immediate danger, I would not recommend moving anybody after an accident. So ABC, airway, breathing, circulation, this being the beginning of the airway. If the head is tucked, if somebody's in a fetal position, it can block off the airway, make it difficult to pass enough air to maintain life. If a motorcycle is laying on top of them, on their chest, that can inhibit the airway. If they're laying face down in water, that's obviously inhibiting the airway. Then in those cases, they would have to be moved. If we have a cervical injury and somebody's not breathing, like there's something blocking their airway, they're going to die. And we need to preserve life, right? So after we've determined that they are unable to breathe, okay, they're not breathing, then we need to assess that airway. Is that airway blocked, and that's the reason they're not breathing. even if we suspect a cervical spine injury because of scuffs on the helmet or the mechanism of the injury, where they have likely injured their neck. These are some of the very few times you want to move somebody. We're assessing this airway. Is it patent? Is it open? Can they move air in and out of their nose and mouth? Sometimes if it's full of blood or crushed or whatever, they're not able to. I've seen too where they've had blood on the face, and you'll see bubbles appear as they're breathing through the blood. And obviously they're not breathing great, but they're moving some air. And that might have to be cleared so that they can move enough air. So that's airway. The breathing we've continued to talk about, but that's something we need to come back to all the time until we're assured that they can breathe without difficulty on their own. And circulation we'll talk a little bit more in detail about, but that's going to be our pulses. And I'll put a graphic up on the screen. The location of the pulse that we assess depends on the level of injury. So if somebody is unconscious and significantly injured, we check a carotid pulse, okay? That's very close to the head, close to the vital organs, the heart and lungs and things, and major arteries. So we're gonna check that carotid pulse. If we're concerned about an arm, we wanna check the radial because that's closer to the site of injury. And that's what we want to assess the circulation in that place of injury. But if somebody's unconscious, we don't know necessarily where the level of injury is. It might be in the head, so we want to check circulation here. And we'll talk more about circulation in the future. But ABC, airway, breathing, and circulation. Without a patent airway, we can't deliver oxygen to the tissues, especially the brain. That has to be opened, whether we have a cervical injury or not. Breathing, if we're not respirating, we're not pushing oxygen onto the red blood cells and taking the carbon dioxide away, getting oxygen to the tissues. And without circulation, without this heart beating, we're not getting any of those blood products and gases to and from the brain or the rest of the tissues of the body. Again, I want to caution you to fight adrenaline, to not rush into a scene and not rush to move somebody unless their life depends on it. So I have a little prop. So this is spinal column, okay, this part, and this is the pelvis at the end of it, and this is the front. This would be facing front, so like this, okay, and then these ridges go on the back. If we examine the spine, this is the cervical spine in here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I believe it's 8. So this part is the cervical spine. Don't quote me on the number. I'll try and put it on the screen. The skull sits on top of this C1 and it swivels on here. And the brain is up here. Nerve fibers collect and go through the foramen magnum, which is the hole in the bottom of our skull, and go into this open space right here. And this is where the spinal cord runs down the spinal column inside of here. Now, this is very protected, very tough. There's muscles on either side of these spines here. In the thoracic spine, there's ribs coming off around this, and down in the pelvis, there's big muscles that connect the lumbar spine, which is this part here, and here's our sacrum and coccyx down here. And then there's big muscles on the inside as well in your abdominal cavity that attach to your spine and keep you upright and allow you to be mobile. All of that to say that from the cervical spine down, very robust, very strong. Injury is still possible, it's much more difficult. The cervical spine, not only is it smaller and has a lot less muscle attached to it, but got this big old head on top of it, right? So if we're anchored here at the thoracic spine and we have the head up here, then we put on a big old heavy helmet like this, that's a lot of torque on that spine. And I think pound for pound, if you can go lightest possible helmet for this same rating, safety rating, that you're much better off because it has less torque. I think torque is the proper term. Leave it in the comments if you know the proper term. These are vertebrae. Each of these bones is a vertebrae. And then in between the vertebrae You see here's a vertebrae, and then in between the vertebrae are the discs. And these discs are like little pockets of jelly. And so this is what each of the vertebrae sit on, and they're cushioned, okay? So if you fell hard on your tailbone, you feel that shock. It hurts, of course, but the disc helps cushion that blow. It also gives us flexibility. And then inside, right in there, is where the spinal cord runs down from the brain. And then these represent the nerves leaving the spinal cord and then the spinal column, which is the bony structure, and going to the body. So we can see these are representative of little nerves leaving the spinal cord and going to different parts of the body. And we can get way into how the nerves innervate the different tissues and make them work and send signals back and forth. I'm not going to get into all that, but suffice it to say, and in this cervical spine, a lot of things that are vital come out of here. So we want to protect this area. Very soon be getting a collar, the Leatt. I'll put a picture up on the screen here for you to help protect my cervical spine. I've never ridden with one, but I think it's probably a good idea, especially the more off-road riding I do. Here's our little delicate cervical spine. This is why we don't want to move people unless they're going to die. This is why we want to be careful taking off or even moving helmets, because this is so delicate. So if these bones up here in the cervical spine injure the spinal cord, it can shut off signals going from the brain to the body. So regarding spinal injury, there's a primary and secondary injury. If we have vertebrae, and I tell this to all my students as well when I have taught nursing students, all of the words I write are spelled correctly. All of the drawings I do are anatomically correct and to scale. So just so you know, this is all perfect. Okay, so here's a vertebrae, here's a vertebrae, here's a vertebrae, and so on, okay? And if we have a force that comes at the spine, somewhere along the spinal column, then think of it like bashing your thumb with a hammer. We have inflammation, injury in here, okay? So the inflammation starts and kind of, gets all swollen, just like your thumb would if you hit it with a hammer. So this is called the primary injury. Now, as time passes, if we don't do anything about this swelling, and you think about the thumb or you twist an ankle or something like that, if you don't take some ibuprofen, some anti-inflammatories, or you don't put ice on it or whatever, if you don't address it, the inflammation continues. That continues to increase. After you hit your thumb with the hammer, each time you move your thumb, it hurts, right? It continues to hurt and hurts worse. And that's why we want to guard it. We like, don't come near me. Don't come near my thumb. It hurts too bad. We're guarding it. That's a protective mechanism to help limit more injury. Same thing with the spine. If we have this initial inflammation in here, we want to be careful with secondary injury. To flip open a visor could provide that more secondary injury. Trying to take a helmet off, pulling, would be extending the spine. We want to be super careful with the entire spine, but especially the cervical spine. After that primary injury, if we re-injure it, we're compounding this injury here and makes our spinal cord inflamed. And that includes swelling and all kinds of terrible things. And so it expands inside the spinal column. And this expansion alone can cause those symptoms of like paraplegia or quadriplegia, decreased sensation, lack of movement, all of those things. If we don't do something about this inflammation, it will continue to do damage. The initial primary injury might be completely reversible and we have no lingering effects from that. But our secondary injury, that's what we are responsible for as the rescuer. We cannot exacerbate secondary injury. Removing a helmet, moving anybody at all at any level is going to promote secondary injury. We have to log roll, and log roll is something that is best when practiced, but it's keeping the spinal column in the same position. When I say in the same position, we find a victim, and let's say that they're a little bit twisted like this. Here's the pelvis and their head is like this, so they're twisted. We want to move them in that twisted position. If we straighten them out and then do what we want to do, we're exacerbating that secondary injury by doing this, okay? When we log roll, if they're like laying face down, okay, we maintain the same position as we move them over to limit secondary injury and decrease that inflammation. If we had to take off the helmet in order to get to the airway, to open the airway, to give CPR, I'm not going to teach CPR. If we had to do those things, I have these poles in here, these red poles. Remove these cheek pads so that the helmet slides off without pulling on that spine and causing more secondary injury. There are some helmets, and I'll include a link below that talks about removing helmets after a trauma to decrease that secondary injury. It's from the Australian EMS. I would not recommend doing that unless someone is going to die, okay? Don't do it unless someone is going to die. If you need to know how to do it, there's that pamphlet in there that I just found online and I included. Whatever this way is.